I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. Share with us where you're listening from, and has something ever arrived at your door that you truly didn't expect? Be sure to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now let the story unfold. Chapter 1. Blackcord on the Breakfast Tray. The Village of Saint. Mary Mead wore the early days of autumn with the same quiet dignity it brought to every season. The elms along the lane had begun their slow surrender to gold, and the morning air carried that particular freshness which arrives only in September, when the heat of summer has at last conceded, and the garden beds stand in their final, composed arrangement before the first frosts come. It was, Miss Jane Marple had always felt, the most thoughtful time of year, a season given over to reflection rather than activity, to the gathering in of things rather than their dispersal. Miss Marple herself was engaged that Tuesday morning in the very act of gathering in, or rather sorting through, a quantity of correspondence which had accumulated on the small table beside her armchair. She had breakfasted at 8:30, as was her custom, and had since been dividing her attention between a letter from her niece in Torquay and a rather fine view of the garden, where the dahlias were performing admirably in the pale sunlight. It was Mrs. Brent, her daily woman, who brought the package. She appeared at the sitting-room door with a slightly uncertain air, holding the parcel as one might hold something borrowed from a stranger, aware of its weight, but unsure of one's right to it. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Brent, "but this has come round from the vicarage. Mr. Clement's boy left it not 10 minutes past. Said it had been sitting on the vicarage steps since Monday evening, addressed to you, only someone had written St. Mary Mead Vicarage in error." Miss Marple set down her niece's letter and held out her hand. The parcel was small, not much larger than a lady's handkerchief box, and wrapped in brown paper of the plain, undistinguished sort one could purchase at any stationer's. The string that bound it was black. Not the ordinary household twine of pale buff or faded brown, but a deliberate deep funereal black. Miss Marple regarded this detail with the quiet attention she was accustomed to bestow upon small things, for she had found, over the course of a rather long life, that small things were frequently the most informative. There was no return address. Her own name and the village were written in a careful, upright hand that suggested a person unaccustomed to haste. The postmark was smudged beyond reading, though she thought she could make out the first 2 letters of a town name, possibly a port, possibly not. She untied the black cord. It was real mourning cord, she was quite certain of that, and unwrapped the brown paper with methodical patience. Inside, nestled on a small square of folded white tissue, lay a brooch. It was a delicate thing. The setting was silver, modest and fine, and upon it were arranged seed pearls in a gentle curving pattern suggestive of a spray of flowers. The pearls themselves were small and creamy, with that slightly warm tone which distinguished the genuine article from its imitations, and they had not been recently cleaned, which spoke of long storage rather than habitual wear. The brooch had the look of something from 40 or 50 years past, quality work, but of the restrained, unfashionable variety that young women of good but not wealthy family might have received as a gift from an older relative. Beneath the tissue was a small card, the kind one might enclose with flowers or a calling visit. On it, written in the same careful upright hand, were 7 words only. It was never hers to lose. Miss Marple read this message twice, then set it beside the brooch on the table, and sat for a moment in thoughtful stillness. The parcel had been redirected from the vicarage, which meant it had been misaddressed, or rather, had been sent by someone who did not know Miss Marple's precise location within the village, but knew she was associated with it. That was suggestive of someone not local, someone who knew the village by reputation or memory rather than by present acquaintance. The black cord troubled her mildly. Its use was not accidental. Mourning cord, in the old tradition, was employed at burials and in the wrapping of objects associated with the recently deceased. The implication was plain enough. This parcel was connected to a death. There had been only one death in St. Mary Mead in the past month that could be described as recent, and that was the death of Mr. Henry Ashcombe. Mr. Ashcombe had been, for as long as Miss Marple could clearly remember, one of those figures whom a village accepts as permanent and characterful without ever knowing very deeply. He had retired to St. Mary Mead some 25 or 30 years since, having spent the greater part of his working life as a schoolmaster in a small market town in Shropshire. He was a spare, quiet man of perhaps 70 years, with a neat grey beard and the mildly distracted air common to those who have spent decades in the company of children and have consequently learned that silence, in adults, is a considerable luxury. He had occupied a small stone cottage at the far end of Church Lane, kept a respectable garden, attended services regularly though not with conspicuous piety, and participated in village life in the measured peripheral way of someone who has chosen solitude not from misanthropy but from long habit. He had died 3 weeks past on a Thursday of a heart complaint that had been quietly monitored for some years. His passing had caused the kind of gentle regret that accompanies the departure of those who have done no harm and made no enemies. Miss Marple had attended the funeral, as had most of the village. Mr. Ashcombe had left no family, or none that had come forward. She took up the brooch again and turned it in the light. It was not, she thought, the sort of object that a retired bachelor would possess. Schoolmasters in modest circumstances did not, as a rule, keep pearl brooches wrapped in tissue paper. The possibility that he had purchased it was not entirely to be dismissed, but the care with which it had been preserved, in its tissue wrapping, in whatever box or drawer it had inhabited for years, suggested sentimental value rather than commercial ownership. It had been kept. That implied attachment. She was still considering this when Mrs. Brent reappeared to ask whether she would want the dining table laid for luncheon, as her nephew Raymond had mentioned he might call. "Not until 12 at the earliest, Mrs. Brent," said Miss Marple, and then, in the same equable tone, "Did you know Mr. Ashcombe at all? In the ordinary way of things?" Mrs. Brent paused at the door with the expression of one recalling a person who had not previously been worth recalling. "Not to say no, Miss Marple. He bought his vegetables from old Larkin's boy, and he got his newspapers from Tuffnell's. Quiet sort. Kept himself to himself, though Mrs. Winfield thought well of him, I believe. She used to call in on him now and then, neighbourly, like." "Mrs. or Winfield," repeated Miss Marple, as if simply confirming the name. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Clara Winfield. She's chairman of the reading circle again this year. Very respectable lady." Mrs. Brent offered this last remark with a slight emphasis that suggested respectability was something Mrs. Winfield had perhaps worked at, which was a different thing from coming by it naturally. Miss Marple nodded and said nothing further, and Mrs. Brent withdrew. Mrs. Clara Winfield was indeed well known in the village. She was a widow of some 60 years, handsome in the composed, careful fashion of women who have always understood the value of presentation, with silver hair arranged with precision, and a manner that combined warmth with a certain underlying authority. She had been born, Miss Marple recalled, Clara Morton, one of the Morton family of Willow Lane, which had been a somewhat better connected family once than it was now. She had married the late Mr. Gerald Winfield, a solicitor, and had outlived him by 15 years, during which time she had established herself as one of the more prominent figures in village society. She was patron of the reading circle, a reliable contributor to the church restoration fund, and universally regarded as a woman of sound judgment and genuine benevolence. It was, therefore, all the more interesting that when Miss Marple, in the course of an afternoon errand that took her past Willow Lane, mentioned the parcel, quite casually in the manner of someone sharing an amusing village curiosity, Mrs. Winfield had gone quite still. The stillness had lasted only a moment. Clara Winfield was far too accomplished a woman to allow more than a moment's unguarded reaction. She had recovered with admirable composure, expressed appropriate interest, said that how singular, and smoothly redirected the conversation toward the Autumn Fair Committee. Her smile had not faltered. But Miss Marple had seen the stillness, and she had noted, too, that Clara Winfield had not asked what the brooch looked like. Most people, upon hearing of an anonymous parcel containing a piece of jewellery and a cryptic message, would have asked at once what it looked like. Curiosity was the natural response. Clara Winfield had not been curious. She had been careful. Miss Marple walked home through the yellowing lane with the black cord in her thoughts, and the composed, careful face of Mrs. Clara Winfield rather more clearly before her than the golden afternoon warranted. It was never hers to lose. She turned the words over as she walked, slowly and with great attention, the way one turns a pebble in a stream to see what might be beneath it. The question, she reflected, was not so much whose it had been, as whose it had been said not to be, and what had become of the person to whom that quiet verdict had once been applied. Chapter 2. A Brooch of Seed Pearls. Miss Marple was not by temperament an impulsive woman. She did not spring to conclusions as some people spring to telephones, breathlessly and with the expectation of drama. Her method, if it could be dignified with so deliberate a word, was closer to the way a good gardener approaches an unfamiliar plant. One observes, one consults, one waits for the season to reveal what the seed intends to become. Patience, in her experience, was not merely a virtue. It was a form of intelligence, and so, having noted Mrs. Winfield's careful stillness, she did not pursue the matter that same afternoon. She went home, ate a sensible supper, and took up her knitting, a cardigan in pale blue wool for her great-niece in Torquay, and allowed the events of the day to settle in her mind the way tea leaves settle in a cup, arranging themselves eventually into something that could be read. By Wednesday morning she decided to pay a visit to Miss Eleanor Pritt. Miss Pritt was the closest thing St. Mary Mead possessed to a living archive. She was 81 years old, sharp as a good pair of scissors, and had occupied the same narrow house on Beech Tree Road for the better part of 6 decades. She had been born in the village, educated in the village, and had spent her working years as assistant to old Dr. Hayward, whose practice had served St. Mary Mead and its surrounding hamlets for 30 years before his retirement. She knew, consequently, who had been born where and to whom, who had married unwisely and who had married well, and which families carried in their histories the particular weight of things that had never been spoken of in polite company. She was not a gossip precisely. She was an accurate woman who happened to possess a great deal of information. She received Miss Marple in a sitting-room that smelled pleasantly of lavender and old paper, and poured tea from a brown pot with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never in her life made a bad cup. Miss Marple began with general observations about the autumn, progressed through the state of the church roof, and arrived at the subject of Mr. Ashcombe by what she trusted appeared to be a natural route. "A very quiet man," she said reflectively, setting down her cup. "I find I knew rather less about him than I might have expected, given that he lived here for nearly 30 years. Miss Pritt regarded her with the mild, unsurprised expression of someone accustomed to conversations that mean rather more than they contain. "Henry Ashcombe was not a man who invited inquiry," she said, "which is, in my experience, either the sign of a very contented person or a very careful one." "And which was he, do you think?" "Careful," said Miss Pritt without hesitation, "though not unhappy, I think. Resigned is perhaps the better word. He had the manner of a man who had made a decision long ago and had since learned to live inside it." She paused and poured a second cup without being asked. "You have heard something, I expect." Miss Marple mentioned the parcel, the black cord, the brooch, the message, in the same economical way she had presented it to Mrs. Winfield, though without the casualness. Miss Pritt was not a woman one needed to be casual with. Miss Pritt listened without interruption. When Miss Marple had finished, the older woman sat for a moment with her cup held in both hands, gazing at the middle distance in the manner of someone consulting an internal catalogue. "Seed pearls," she said at last. "In a silver setting. A spray of flowers, you said?" "Yes." "Then I believe I know what it is." She set down her cup with great precision. "Or rather, I know what it was. It belonged to a young woman called Eliza Morton. She was Clara Winfield's cousin, Clara Morton, as she was then. The two girls grew up together in that house on Willow Lane, after Eliza's parents died. Eliza was perhaps 2 or 3 years the younger." Miss Marple said nothing, and Miss Pritt continued. Eliza Mourning was a perfectly agreeable young woman, not brilliant, not especially remarkable, but pleasant and good-natured, and rather pretty in the fair, unremarkable way that tends to go unnoticed until it is gone. She was on what I believe was generally understood to be an informal understanding with Henry Ashcombe, not an announced engagement, nothing so definite as that, but the sort of arrangement that a village takes as settled, because both parties have behaved as though it were settled for long enough that the question has ceased to be interesting. And Mr. Ashcombe? He was a young man then, perhaps 30. He had just received the position at the school in Shropshire, and there was talk of his returning for Eliza once he was established. Perfectly conventional. Miss Pritt paused. And then, one summer, it would have been in the late 1920s, I believe, certainly before the war, Eliza left. Departed, quietly, without ceremony, and without the sort of explanation that would have satisfied the village had anyone been offered one, which they were not. Miss Pritt's tone was dry, but not unkind. There was talk, of course. There is always talk. The talk, as I recall it, concerned a missing brooch, a pearl brooch belonging to an aunt of the Mourning girls, which had been given to Clara, but which Eliza had, it was suggested, taken without leave. Nothing was ever proved. No one was ever accused directly, because accusations of that nature in a village have a way of attaching themselves to the accuser as much as the accused. But the suggestion existed, and Eliza was not there to answer it. Miss Marple looked at the window, where a sparrow was attending to the bird bath with great seriousness. And Clara? Clara remained, said Miss Pritt, as people do. There was a brief silence in which a considerable amount was said without either woman finding it necessary to say it. Did anyone maintain contact with Eliza? Asked Miss Marple presently. I could not tell you with certainty. If Henry Ashcombe did, he kept it very private. He was, as I said, a careful man. Miss Pritt folded her hands in her lap. I will say this, and it is observation rather than opinion. In the year or so after Eliza's departure, Henry Ashcombe altered considerably. He had been a sociable enough young man. Afterward he became noticeably quieter, the sort of quiet that is not temperamental but chosen. She met Miss Marple's eyes briefly. One forms impressions. One does, agreed Miss Marple. She walked home through the village at a measured pace, and nodding to Mrs. Hathaway outside the post office, and pausing briefly to admire young Tom Alsop's bicycle, which he had painted a very bold shade of red, and was clearly hoping someone would remark upon. Miss Marple obliged him with a genuine compliment and continued on her way. The brooch had belonged to Eliza Mourning. It had been suggested, never proved, never formally stated, but suggested, that Eliza had taken it. She had left under that shadow, and the shadow had remained in her place while she herself had vanished from the village's collective vision. But the brooch had not, it now appeared, vanished with her. It had been in Henry Ashcombe's keeping, preserved in tissue paper, held for perhaps 40 years. The message returned to her with a new weight. It was never hers to lose, not hers to lose, not hers to steal, not hers to take, but to lose. As though the brooch was something that had been removed not by the hand of the person blamed, but from her, taken away from her, rather than by her. Miss Marple turned this distinction over very carefully as she unlatched her garden gate and made her way up the path to her front door. The dahlias nodded pleasantly in the light breeze, and she acknowledged them with the same thoughtful attention she brought to everything this particular week. Someone, it seemed, wished a correction to be made, and corrections of this sort, she knew from considerable experience, were rarely sent by strangers. Chapter 3. An Empty Chair at the Reading Circle. The St. Mary Mead Reading Circle met on the second and fourth Thursday of each month in the back room of the village hall, a space that smelled faintly of floor wax and hymn books, and which, through long association with improving literature and mild refreshment, had acquired an atmosphere of permanent, slightly institutional coziness. The chairs were arranged in a rough oval. The curtains were a determined shade of green, and on the table in the corner Mrs. Hopwood unfailingly produced a plate of shortbread biscuits that were always slightly thicker on one side than the other, which nobody mentioned because they were very good. Miss Marple had been a member of the circle for 11 years. She attended not because she required the company of others in order to appreciate literature. She was perfectly capable of that alone, in her own armchair, but because she had found, over time, that a gathering of 8 or 9 people assembled for one ostensible purpose was frequently productive of a great deal of information about quite another. People talked around books in much the same way they talked around their real preoccupations, circling, approaching, retreating, occasionally saying rather more than they had intended. This particular Thursday, the circle was to discuss a novel about a family in the Lake District, a perfectly respectable choice, involving a disputed inheritance, 2 estranged sisters, and a solicitor of dubious reliability. Miss Marple had read it the previous weekend with moderate enjoyment and considered opinions. She arrived at the village hall at 2:30, which was 10 minutes before the appointed time. This was deliberate. Early arrival allowed one to observe the room before it was fully occupied, which was an entirely different thing from observing it afterward. She settled into her usual chair, third from the window with a clear view of the door, and accepted a cup of tea from young Mrs. Hopwood, who managed the refreshments with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not expect to be thanked, and is pleasantly surprised when she is. The members arrived in their customary order. Mr. Garvey, the retired bank manager, whose enthusiasm for fiction was genuine, but whose critical vocabulary was limited principally to the words gripping and not quite my sort of thing. The 2 Miss Fellows, sisters of indeterminate but considerable age, who invariably agreed with one another during the meeting and disagreed afterward on the walk home. Mrs. Partridge, who taught at the junior school and read everything with the attentive eye of a woman looking for material she could use, and 3 or 4 others whose names and habits Miss Marple knew as thoroughly as she knew the planting schedule of her own garden. Mrs. Clara Winfield arrived last. This was unusual. Clara Winfield was, as a rule, punctual to the point of mild self-congratulation. She took some quiet satisfaction in being seated and composed when others arrived, and Miss Marple had noticed over the years that this particular habit was one Clara shared with people who regard their own reliability as a form of superiority, rather than merely a personal preference. To arrive last, therefore, was a departure. She entered with her habitual composure intact, silver hair arranged, grey wool coat unfastened with unhurried ease, but Miss Marple observed, with the attentiveness she applied to such things, that she had applied her powder with rather more thoroughness than the afternoon warranted, and that there was a slight controlled tension at the corners of her mouth which cosmetics could conceal, but not entirely dissolve. She took her seat, the chair directly opposite Miss Marple, which was also by long custom the chairman's position, greeted the room with a warm collective smile and opened proceedings. The discussion of the Lake District novel proceeded along its usual lines for some 20 minutes. Mr. Garvey found it gripping. One of the Miss Fellows felt the elder sister had been treated rather unfairly by the author, and the other Miss Fellows disagreed, though not yet audibly. Mrs. Partridge said something perceptive about the function of the solicitor as a narrative device that briefly gave the conversation an elevation it had not previously possessed. It was Mrs. Partridge, in fact, who introduced the subject, quite without design so far as Miss Marple could determine. "It puts me in mind," said Mrs. Partridge with the slightly abstracted air of someone pursuing a genuine association rather than a conversational gambit, of old Miss Renfrew's situation years ago, when her family disputed the Breckenridge property. Though of course that involved cousins rather than sisters. She paused. "It always seems to be cousins, or in these cases. Cousins are proximity without sufficient obligation," said Miss Marple, in the mild conversational tone she used when saying things she meant rather precisely. There was a small ripple of appreciative laughter. "Well," said Mr. Garvey, "it is certainly true that the closer the relationship, the more considerable the grievance." "Families," said Mrs. Hopwood, from her post by the refreshment table, with the succinct authority of someone who had one. It was in this atmosphere of general, comfortable reflection on the topic of family complication that someone, Miss Marple thought it was the quieter of the two Miss Fellows, the one who embroidered during meetings, and said quite casually, "I suppose it will be different now without poor Mr. Ashcombe. He always had something sensible to say about inheritance disputes, having been a schoolmaster, very methodical thinker." There was a brief, natural pause of the kind that accompanies the mention of the recently dead in agreeable company. Respectful, but not prolonged. "He is missed," said Clara Winfield. Her voice was entirely steady. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were folded in her lap with a composure that required a degree of intention. "Did he attend the circle long?" asked Miss Marple, with genuine seeming inquiry. She knew perfectly well the answer, but the question was not asked for the answer. "A number of years," said Clara. "He was here before I became chairman, a very faithful member." A brief pause. "He had a particular fondness for novels set in the past, historical ones. He said they were honest about the distance between people's intentions and their actions." This observation was received as a pleasantly literary remark. Miss Marple received it as something more. "He had no family to speak of?" asked Mrs. Partridge, whose professional habit of interest in individual circumstances was thoroughly genuine. "None that came forward," said Clara. The same 3 words Miss Marple herself had employed in her own thoughts, which was interesting. "He was always very self-contained. I think some people prefer to leave things tidy rather than complicate others with their arrangements. He had no particular connections in the village from earlier days," Miss Marple continued, maintaining the tone of pleasant, a idle interest one adopts when discussing a mutual acquaintance who is safely beyond embarrassment. "I always had the impression he had been here before, in his younger years, I mean, or had connections of some kind." Clara's eyes met hers across the oval of chairs. The contact lasted only a moment, the ordinary duration of a conversational glance, but there was in it a quality of appraisal that Clara immediately curtained with a pleasant expression. "I believe he may have had some passing acquaintance with the village at one point," she said, "though I could not say with any certainty. He was not a man who spoke at length about his past." She turned to Mr. Garvey with a smile of practised warmth. "Now, I think we had not yet settled the question of the solicitor's motivations." The discussion resumed. Shortbread was distributed. The elder Miss Fellows expressed her disagreement with her sister at last, and was received with the cheerful resignation of long habit. Miss Marple ate her shortbread, contributed 2 further observations about the novel, and listened throughout with the particular quality of attention that looked, to all ordinary appearances, very much like a pleasant old lady enjoying an afternoon among friends. Afterward, walking home through the lane where the first fallen leaves had begun to gather in the gutter, she turned over what she had collected. Clara Winfield had described Henry Ashcombe as a man who preferred to leave things tidy, yet here was a parcel, sent after his death, containing a pearl brooch and a message of deliberate correction. That was not tidiness. That was the opposite. A thread left deliberately loose, or rather a thread that someone else had now chosen to pull. And Clara had spoken of his connection to the village with the careful vagueness of a person not recalling but concealing. There is a distinct difference in the texture of the two, and Miss Marple, who had spent a considerable number of years attending to texture, had not the slightest difficulty in telling them apart. The chair Henry Ashcombe had occupied at the reading circle stood empty in her mind, not with the blankness of mere absence, but with the particular quality of a space that had once been filled by something more complicated than it appeared. Chapter 4. The Boathouse at Willowmere. The following morning brought a sky of that particular pale clarity that belongs exclusively to early autumn in the English countryside. Not the bright, assertive blue of summer, but something more considered, as though the season were choosing its words with care before speaking. Miss Marple, who had slept rather better than might have been expected given the activity of her thoughts the evening before, breakfasted with appetite, attended to a quantity of correspondence, and then dressed for walking. she had decided to call upon Mr. Edmund Larkin. The name had come to her by an indirect route, as useful names often do. Mrs. Brent, in one of her frequent and informative domestic observations, had mentioned some weeks previously that old Larkin's vegetable deliveries to the late Mr. Ashcombe had been among the last visits the man received before his decline. Larkin had apparently expressed to Mrs. Brent a certain gruff, an unsentimental sorrow at the loss of a long-standing customer, which Mrs. Brent had relayed with the sympathetic attention she reserved for matters affecting the older generation. Miss Marple had filed this away with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, and now drew it out again. Edmund Larkin lived in a low stone cottage on the southern edge of the village, beyond the lane that wound down toward Willow Mere. He was a man of 73 or thereabouts, broad-shouldered in the way of those who have worked outdoors all their lives and retain the structural evidence of it, even in age, with a face weathered to the consistency and colour of good bark and a deliberate, unhurried manner that suggested someone who had long ago made a private arrangement with time and found it satisfactory. He had been the gardener at Willow Lane House in his younger years, before it had been sold out of the Morton family, and had subsequently set up his own kitchen garden enterprise, supplying vegetables to half a dozen households in St. Mary Mead with a reliability that had made him, over the decades, a quietly indispensable figure. He received Miss Marple without particular surprise, in the way that people who have spent most of their lives close to the natural world tend to receive unexpected visitors, as one receives a change in weather, accepting it as a fact and accommodating oneself accordingly. He offered her a chair in his kitchen and put a kettle on without being asked. Miss Marple admired his runner beans, which were visible through the window in commendable quantity, and they discussed the relative merits of several varieties for some minutes before she allowed the conversation to settle, quite naturally, upon the subject of Willow Lane House and the Morton family. "I understand you worked there as a young man," she said. "Before the house was sold?" 20-odd years, said Larkin, measuring tea into the pot with the same unhurried precision he applied, she suspected, to everything he did. "Starting when I was 15. Good ground, that garden. Heavy soil, mind, and the area near the mere ran damp all winter, but good ground if you knew how to manage it." He set the teapot on the table. The Morton family were decent enough. Mr. Morton Senior was a quiet sort. The missus more particular about the flower borders than was perhaps sensible. "And the girls?" asked Miss Marple. "Miss Clara and Miss Eliza?" He glanced at her with the mild assessing look of a man who has spent decades reading ground conditions and can extend the faculty to other matters when required. He did not appear disturbed by the question, but there was a brief moment of consideration before he answered. "Clara was the elder," he said, "practical. Claire always knew what she wanted and generally arranged to have it. Eliza was softer in her manner, more inclined to sit by the water and think than to get on with things. Not a criticism," he added, with a certain old-fashioned fairness. "There's room in the world for thinkers. They were very close, I believe." "To a point," said Larkin. He poured tea into 2 plain cups and placed one before her. "As close as 2 people can be when one of them wants something the other has. And both of them are too well brought up to say so directly." Miss Marple received this observation with the attentiveness it deserved. "You mean Mr. Ashcombe," she said. "I was never told anything official about it," said Larkin, with the care of a man who distinguishes between what he knows and what he has concluded, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, a distinction surprisingly few people troubled to maintain. "But I had eyes. Young Ashcombe used to come to the house on Saturday evenings. He was friendly to both girls, the way a decent young man is friendly to both when his preference is clear to everyone except perhaps himself. Eliza was easy with him, comfortable, as if they had known each other a great while. Clara was—" He paused, turning his cup in his hands. "Attentive is the word. Very attentive." "And the evening by the lake?" asked Miss Marple. "I had heard there was some sort of disagreement." Larkin looked at her steadily. "I was working late that evening. There had been trouble with the drainage near the boathouse, and I wanted to get a good look at it before the light went." He set down his cup. "I didn't hear what was said. I was some distance off and not trying to hear, but I saw them, Ashcombe and Eliza by the boathouse door. Voices raised, or at least one voice raised. Hers, then silence. Then she walked back toward the house on her own, and he stood there for a good while looking at the water. He paused. Clara had been there earlier in the afternoon, on the bench by the mere. Whether she was still there when it happened, I couldn't say. Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. And after that evening? Eliza was gone within a fortnight, said Larkin, with the flat simplicity of someone reporting a fact whose emotional dimensions he has had considerable time to accommodate. Nobody told me why. These things weren't explained to gardeners. A brief dryness crossed his expression. There was talk about a piece of jewellery, but there's always talk about something when a young woman leaves suddenly. Talk finds a shape to fit itself to. You did not believe she had taken it. I believed what I saw, said Larkin, which was a girl who packed her things and left without farewells, and a household that was very quiet afterward, even for a quiet household. And young Ashcombe stopped calling. He met her eyes with the steady, unembarrassed directness of a man who has examined his own observations and finds them consistent. A man whose sweetheart has been proved dishonest doesn't generally look as though he's the one who has done the damage. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her cup warm between her hands, considering the view through the kitchen window, the late beans, the trimmed path, the orderly geometry of a garden that reflected its keeper's character entirely. After Eliza left, she said, what became of Clara's manner toward Mr. Ashcombe? Larkin gave this the same measured consideration he gave everything. She called on the family more regularly, he said, brought things, small kindnesses of the sort that are difficult to refuse without appearing ungrateful. Ashcombe was polite, always polite, but he had gone elsewhere in some fashion. Still present and still civil, but the part of him that mattered had gone somewhere else and didn't entirely come back. He said this without particular emphasis, as though it were a straightforward horticultural observation rather than a quietly devastating one. Miss Marple thanked him for the tea, which had been excellent, and for the conversation, which she did not characterize. He walked her to the gate with the courtesy of a man for whom the gesture was simply how things were done, and she made her way back along the lane that curved toward Willowmere. She paused at the point where the path opened briefly onto a view of the water. The mere was pale and still in the September light, its surface carrying the reflections of the reed beds along the near shore with the careful fidelity of old glass. Somewhere along that bank there stood a boathouse. She could make out the shape of its dark roof among the willows, and on an evening, perhaps 40 years past, a young woman had walked away from it alone toward a house in which, as it turned out, her remaining time was already being measured. Miss Marple stood for a moment and looked at the water. Then she turned and walked home, with the particular expression of someone who has not yet assembled the whole of a thing but can now see quite clearly the shape of what is missing. Chapter 5. Pressed lilac between pages. The question of Mr. Ashcombe's personal effects had, as Miss Marple understood it, been placed in the hands of Mr. Fellows of Fellows and Briggs, the village's established firm of solicitors, there being no immediate family and no contested will, Mr. Ashcombe had left modest instructions bequeathing his few financial assets to a school library fund in Shropshire, and his household contents to whatever charitable purpose the executor thought fit. The matter had proceeded with the quiet, undramatic efficiency that characterizes the administration of solitary lives. The executor, in this case, was a Mr. Geoffrey Thornton, a retired schoolmaster colleague of Ashcombe's who had made the journey down from Shropshire for the funeral, and had subsequently taken on the task of sorting the cottage with the same conscientious reluctance one might bring to any obligation that is both necessary and unwelcome. Miss Marple knew of him through the vicar, who had been helpful and had established from Mrs. Brent, who had it from Mrs. Fellows, who had it from the solicitor's secretary, that Mr. Thornton was still in residence at the Three Crowns and expected to remain until the end of the week. She met him there on Thursday afternoon, in the small sitting room off the main entrance that the Three Crowns maintained for private conversations, insurance adjusters, and the occasional difficult family occasion. It was a room of brown upholstery and oil paintings of agricultural scenes, and it smelled persistently of pipe tobacco long extinguished, as though previous occupants had left something of themselves behind whether they intended to or not. Mr. Thornton was a tall, slightly stooped man of perhaps 68, with the mild, carefully maintained patience of someone who had spent 40 years explaining things to people who did not immediately understand them, and had found, on balance, that the work was worth doing. He wore a good wool suit that had seen considerable service, and carried himself with the particular dignity of the self-made man who has never quite lost his sense of the distance travelled. He received Miss Marple with genuine courtesy. The vicar had smoothed the way admirably, and when she explained with great care and complete candour that she had received an anonymous parcel following Mr. Ashcombe's death, and was attempting to understand its origins, he listened with the attentiveness of someone who takes information seriously. "I'm glad someone is attending to it," he said, when she'd finished. "I confess the cottage raised questions I had no means of answering. Henry was the most private of men. I knew him professionally for nearly 15 years, and I would not say I knew him well, which is a peculiar thing to admit of a colleague." "Private in a particular direction?" asked Miss Marple. "About his life before Shropshire," said Thornton. "He spoke freely enough about the school, the boys, his opinions on teaching methods, the state of the country generally, but of his earlier years he said very little. He referred to a village once, I believe it was this one, but only in passing and did not encourage the subject." He folded his hands. There was a quality about him of someone who has tidied a room very thoroughly, and then closed the door on it, present and engaged, but with a portion of himself behind that door. Miss Marple thought of Clara Winfield's remark at the reading circle, that Henry had been a man who preferred to leave things tidy, and found it interesting that two people who had known him in entirely separate contexts had arrived at the same word independently. "When you were sorting through the cottage," she said, "did you find anything that struck you as unexpected? Books, letters, personal keepsakes of any kind?" Thornton considered this with the seriousness it warranted. He had a great many books which one expected. Religious texts, history, a good deal of natural history. He was fond of that. But among them, he paused with the slight hesitation of someone uncertain whether what they are about to share is relevant. "I found an old devotional, a small one, the sort given to young people at confirmation, which contained two things pressed between the pages. The first was a sprig of dried flowers, lilac, I thought, though it was much faded. The second was a railway ticket." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the deliberate care of someone who does not wish to betray the degree of their interest by any sudden movement. "A railway ticket," she said. "Old, very old. Perhaps 40 years, perhaps more. It was a single ticket, unused, for a line I did not recognize. The destination had faded almost entirely, but the date, or what I took to be the date, appeared to be in late summer, perhaps early September. The sort of ticket," he added, with a slight frown of retrospective puzzlement, "that one keeps not because it was used, but because of what it represents." "An intention," said Miss Marple quietly, "precisely. An intention that was not acted upon." Thornton looked at the agricultural painting above the fireplace for a moment. "I confess it struck me as melancholy. A man who had kept, for 40 years, the evidence of a journey he never made. I could not determine the destination, but the ticket had been preserved as carefully as anything in that cottage, which is to say, very carefully indeed. And the devotional book, did it have an inscription?" "It did, on the inside front cover, for Eliza, with love and hope, from Aunt M, Christmas, 1921. The name Eliza was what arrested me. Henry had no female relatives that I knew of, and I thought it odd that he should have kept a book belonging to someone else for so many years." He met Miss Marple's eyes with the directness of a man who's been patient long enough. "I think, Miss Marple, that you know who Eliza was." "I believe so," she said. "Her name was Eliza Morton. She was a young woman of this village who left rather suddenly some 40 years ago. She and Mr. Ashcombe had been closely acquainted." Thornton received this without apparent surprise, which suggested that some part of him had already arranged the available evidence into roughly this shape and had simply been waiting for confirmation. "The book and the ticket," said Miss Marple after a brief companionable pause. "Are they still at the cottage?" "I have them here, as a matter of fact. I was not certain what to do with them and felt they ought not simply to go to a charity sale." He rose and crossed to the leather case beside the door and returned with a small and dark-covered book which he placed on the table between them. Miss Marple opened it with great gentleness. The inscription was exactly as Thornton had described. A schoolgirl hand, rounded and earnest, the ink faded to brown. Between pages 40 and 41, where a psalm about consolation occupied the left-hand page and the evening prayer the right, lay the pressed lilac, a small flat ghost of a flower, its colour reduced to the palest silver grey, still faintly structural, the individual florets barely distinguishable, and between the back pages folded once the railway ticket, a single printed card, its paper thickened with age, the destination worn to near invisibility, the date recoverable only in its general character, a summer or early autumn decades past. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. Henry Ashcombe had kept this book, and he had kept the lilac, presumably Eliza's, and the unused ticket that marked the moment he had intended to follow her and had not. She did not know what had prevented him. Perhaps doubt, perhaps Clara's intervention, perhaps some failure of courage at the precise moment when courage would have altered everything. Whatever the reason, the ticket had remained in the book, and the book had remained in the cottage, and the cottage had remained in St. Mary Mead, while Eliza Morton had boarded a steamer for a country she had not chosen, and built a life in the absence of the person who had, apparently, meant to come after her. He knew, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. At some point, perhaps quite late, he knew. "Knew what?" asked Thornton. "That the wrong person had been blamed." She closed the book gently and folded her hands upon it. And I believe the parcel was sent so that someone else might know it too." The oil painting above the fireplace showed a farmer in a field at harvest, his back broad and patient against a pewter sky. Miss Marple regarded it briefly, and thought that there was a great deal to be said for the virtue of arriving, in the end, even if one had taken the longer route. Chapter 6, Candlesticks in the Attic Trunk. Miss Marple had always held that the most revealing conversations are those which do not announce themselves as such. The formal interview, with its atmosphere of declared purpose and mutual wariness, produces a particular quality of response, cautious, shaped, aware of its own significance. But the conversation that begins as something else entirely, that arrives sideways into the truth it is after, has access to a different register of the human voice. People are considerably more candid when they believe themselves to be merely passing the time. It was with this principle in mind that she accepted, on Friday morning, Mrs. Winfield's invitation to help assess the contents of the Willow Lane house attic. The invitation had arisen quite naturally, or at least with the appearance of naturalness that Clara Winfield brought to most of her arrangements. They had encountered one another outside the post office on Thursday afternoon, and Clara had mentioned, with the slightly resigned air of one who has been putting off a necessary task, that she was finally attending to the upper rooms of Willow Lane House, the family home she still maintained, though she lived for most purposes in the smaller cottage on the far side of the garden. There were trunks and boxes accumulated over several generations, she said, and she could perfectly well manage alone, but would welcome a second opinion on one or two pieces of furniture that might be of interest to the church sale. Would Miss Marple care to come? Miss Marple would. Willow Lane House was a solidly built property of the early Victorian period, and with generous rooms and the kind of accumulated domestic character that comes from 3 generations of a single family occupying the same space and making their individual contributions to it without any systematic attempt at coherence. The hallway alone contained 4 different wallpapers, a barometer that had not been accurate since before the war, and a collection of walking sticks in an umbrella stand that spoke of at least 2 sporty uncles and 1 ambitious aunt. Clara led her up to the attic by the back staircase, talking pleasantly about the church sale and the difficulty of finding reliable volunteers in the comfortable, slightly elevated manner she adopted in her own surroundings. The attic was a long, low-ceilinged space lit by 2 dormer windows in which the accumulated furniture, boxes, and general household surplus of several decades had arranged itself into the sort of informal order that is not quite organisation and not quite chaos, but somewhere companionably between the two. They began with the furniture, which was straightforward enough: a writing desk with a stuck drawer, a nursing chair of genuine quality, 2 mirrors of varying usefulness, and progressed to the smaller items, which were rather less so. It was while they were examining the contents of a large tin trunk near the left-hand window that Miss Marple raised the subject, with the easiness of someone sharing an observation that has just occurred to them. "What a quantity of silver," she said, lifting from the trunk a pair of candlesticks wrapped in tarnished cloth. "Are these the Morton family pieces?" "Some of them," said Clara, not looking up from the box she was sorting. "My mother kept everything. One of those people who cannot bear to part with anything on the grounds that it might be useful eventually." "Very sensible in my experience," said Miss Marple, turning one of the candlesticks in the light from the dormer window, "though it does create work for those who come after. My own aunt was rather the same. She kept a tortoiseshell card case for 40 years on the understanding that someone would want it, and eventually someone did." Clara smiled. It was a genuine enough smile. She was not without warmth, but there was in it a faint quality of the obligatory, of a woman performing the social motions while her attention resided somewhere more guarded. "There were some pieces given away, of course," said Miss Marple in the same reflective tone. "Jewellery in particular has a way of moving through families, gifts and so on." She set down the candlestick. "I believe there was a brooch, pearl was it not, that belonged to your aunt, or your mother. I had it from Miss Pritt, who had an extraordinary memory for the details of village life. The pause that followed was brief, but it had a different quality from the ordinary pauses of conversation. It was the pause of a person deciding rather than a person thinking." "Miss Pritt," said Clara, "is a remarkable woman." Her tone remained pleasant, but the words had the slightly careful spacing of those chosen for their neutrality. "She is," agreed Miss Marple warmly, "though one does not always remember until one speaks with her, quite how much of the village history she carries about with her." She picked up the second candlestick and examined its base with apparent interest. "She mentioned in passing that there had been some unhappy business about that brooch at the time of your cousin Eliza's departure. I hope it is not indelicate to mention it. Old sorrows do have a way of resurfacing, particularly when one is sorting through family things." Another pause. Then Clara set down the box she was holding and straightened, and when she turned to face Miss Marple, her expression had undergone a subtle but perceptible reorganisation. It was not the composed social face she customarily presented, but something behind it, not quite distress and not quite guilt, but something occupying the territory between them that has no single comfortable name. "Eliza was frightened," she said. "At last." The words came out with the contained flatness of something that had been held for a long time under considerable pressure. "She came to me the night before she left. She said she feared there were those who believed the brooch had gone missing on her account, and that she did not see how she could remain in the village with that impression left uncorrected." "And what did you tell her?" asked Miss Marple, with a gentleness that left the question entirely open. Now Clara moved to the dormer window and stood with her back to the room, looking out at the grey September garden below, where the last roses were losing their grip on the wall. "I told her that it would all be resolved," she said, "that these things always were." She was quiet for a moment. "I had fully intended, to find a way to explain the brooch's absence without—" She stopped. "Without revealing how it had come to be absent," said Miss Marple. Clara didn't turn. "It was not theft," she said, with a sudden firmness that sounded like someone correcting a charge. "I had not taken it. I had moved it, hidden it for a time because I was not thinking clearly, and because I was very young, and because Henry was about to—" She stopped again. The garden below was evidently not providing what she had hoped for. I intended to restore it, once things had settled. But Eliza left before they settled, said Miss Marple. Yes. The word fell into the attic's dusty quiet with the weight of a much larger admission. Miss Marple looked at the two candlesticks standing side by side on the lid of the tin trunk, their silver dimmed but their shape intact. There was a quality to old silver, she reflected, a patience almost. It did not deteriorate the way other materials did. It merely waited and tarnished, and waited some more until someone came along with the intention and the cloth. You kept the brooch after Eliza's departure, she said. It was not quite a question. I did not know what to do with it, said Clara, and there was in her voice for the first time something that sounded less like explanation and more like truth. The longer I left it, the more impossible the correction became. There is a certain point past which the admission becomes larger than the original error, and one does not see a way through. She turned from the window at last, and her face had the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has now set it down, not with relief exactly, but with the particular stillness of the moment before relief arrives. I did not anticipate how far it would travel. These things rarely travel where we anticipate, said Miss Marple in the same quiet, undramatic tone. That is perhaps their most significant feature. She began to rewrap the candlesticks in their cloth slowly and carefully, and Clara watched her in silence, and neither of them said anything further on the subject that afternoon. But the subject had been opened, and Miss Marple knew, with the certainty that comes not from evidence alone, but from understanding the moment when a person has run out of the energy required for concealment, that it would not close again. Chapter 7. Whispers by the Cricket Field. Saturday in St. Mary Mead had a particular rhythm to it, distinct from the other days of the week in the way that Saturdays always are in small English villages, less purposeful than the working days, less ceremonial than Sunday, and consequently rather more itself than either. The shops opened at their usual hour, but with a relaxed expectation of custom rather than a brisk one. People walked rather more slowly along the high street, stopped to speak with one another at greater length, and generally conducted themselves as persons entitled to the day rather than merely occupying it. Miss Marple was in her garden by 9 o'clock, attending to the last of the summer's work. There were bulbs to be set in, the Dutch narcissi she ordered each year from a catalogue that arrived, reliably, in late August, and some general tidying of the kind that a garden in early September requires, and even, she thought, appreciates. Thus she found the work conducive to reflection. Her hands could be trusted to perform what was necessary while her mind attended to other business, and the two operations proceeded in companionable parallel without either troubling the other. She was thinking about Clara Winfield. The previous afternoon's conversation had yielded considerably more than she had, if she were honest with herself, expected quite so soon. Clara had spoken, partially, carefully, but spoken nonetheless, and what she had said arranged itself in Miss Marple's mind into a pattern that was becoming increasingly legible. The brooch had been hidden. It had been hidden before Eliza's departure. Clara had framed this as impulsive, temporary, born of youth and confused feeling. She had not said the most important word, which was why, though the why was now, to Miss Marple, sufficiently apparent that its absence from Clara's account was itself informative. She had hidden the brooch because Henry Ashcombe was about to make his intentions toward Eliza permanent. This was the shape of it. Not malice of the calculated, deliberate kind. Clara was not, Miss Marple suspected, constitutionally a malicious woman, but the sudden, unthinking act of someone in whom affection and jealousy had mixed to a degree that briefly overwhelmed good judgment. The brooch had presented itself as a means. In the confusion of the moment she had taken it, or secreted it, and in doing so had set in motion a series of consequences she had almost certainly not foreseen. What had she foreseen? That is always the question, Miss Marple thought, pressing a bulb into the prepared earth with gentle firmness. The people who cause harm through impulsive action rarely foresee anything beyond the immediate, the desired, the temporarily satisfying. The consequences unroll afterward, like a length of ribbon released from the hand, not planned, not intended, but undeniably attached to the original act. It was while she was washing her hands at the kitchen sink at 11:30 that Mrs. Brent appeared with the information that young Mr. Tom Alsop had called. This was unexpected. Tom Alsop was 19, the son of the ironmonger, and his previous interactions with Miss Marple had been limited to the admirable scarlet bicycle and an occasion on which he had retrieved her garden gate latch after it had come loose in a January wind. He was a pleasant, energetic young man with a great deal of dark hair and the kind of open expression that suggests a person has not yet discovered any particular reason to arrange their face into anything more complicated. He was waiting in the front garden, turning his cap in his hands. "I hope I haven't disturbed you, Miss Marple," he said. "Only my grandmother said I ought to tell you because you'd received that parcel, and she'd heard—" she'd heard you were making inquiries about Mr. Ashcombe. Miss Marple's grandmother's intelligence network operated for decades through the medium of Mrs. Alsop Senior, who had been a contemporary and acquaintance of Miss Pritt, and who communicated with her grandson through a combination of instruction and maternal authority that brooked no evasion, had evidently been functioning at its customary efficiency. "Your grandmother is very thoughtful," said Miss Marple. Do come in." She settled him in the sitting room with a glass of lemonade, which he accepted with the slight self-consciousness of a young man being given lemonade by an elderly lady, and aware that the situation is not without a degree of incongruity. Then she waited with the patient, uncritical receptiveness that she had found over many years to be the most effective posture for receiving information from people who were not entirely certain they ought to be offering it. And Tom Alsop turned his cap twice more, then began. He had been, he explained, playing cricket on the village ground last Saturday week, the Saturday before Mr. Ashcombe's funeral as it happened, with a group of friends from the village and one or two from Barton Lacey. The cricket ground at St. Mary Mead occupied a pleasant flat area behind the churchyard wall, and the boundary on the southern side ran adjacent to the lane that led toward Willow Lane House. The match had been an informal one, unserious and thoroughly enjoyable, and had proceeded through the afternoon without incident until, during a natural pause in play, Tom had gone to retrieve a ball struck considerably wide of any reasonable fielding position into the long grass near the boundary hedge. It was while he was searching for the ball in this somewhat secluded corner, partially concealed from the lane by the hedge, that he had heard voices on the other side. "I wasn't listening on purpose," he said, with the conscientiousness of youth. "Only they weren't quiet voices, if you understand me. Not quite an argument, but something of the sort." "Who was speaking?" asked Miss Marple. "Mrs. Winfield," he said. "I knew her voice straight off, and there was a man, older, I thought, from the sound of him, and not a voice I recognised. They were talking about Mr. Ashcombe." He paused, visibly organising his recollection with some care. "The man said something about papers, that he had found papers, I think, and letters, that Henry had kept letters, and that certain things were now clear to him that had not been clear before." He frowned slightly. "I couldn't catch all of it, Miss Marple. I wasn't trying to hear, and I found the ball fairly quickly once I knew where to look, so I didn't stay long. But Mrs. Winfield said—" I did hear this clearly, that whatever had been the case in the past was a private matter that concerned no one living. He met her eyes with the earnest directness of someone delivering what they considered to be the significant portion of their account. And the man said that it concerned him, because it had concerned his mother. A brief stillness settled over the sitting room. "His mother," repeated Miss Marple. "Yes, Miss Marple." She was quiet for a moment, her knitting lying untouched in her lap. She had picked it up from habit when she sat down and had so far not made a single stitch. A man who said that the matter had concerned his mother. A man whose voice Tom Alsop had not recognised. A man who had found letters among Henry Ashcombe's papers which, by this point, would have been in the keeping of Mr. Geoffrey Thornton. She thought of the parcel and its careful wrapping. She thought of the handwriting, upright, deliberate, or the hand of someone who had composed themselves before writing, who had given the act of sending the letter the seriousness it deserved. She had attributed the parcel to a woman, partly from the content, a pearl brooch returned, a judgment quietly reversed, and partly from some instinct she had not fully examined. But instincts, she reminded herself, are useful precisely when one does not mistake them for conclusions. It concerned his mother. She thanked Tom Alsop with genuine warmth, saw him to the door and watched him retrieve his bicycle from the front gate with the natural ease of the young, that slight bounce in the step that is not quite swagger and not quite joy, but somewhere in between, and which Miss Marple always found, privately, rather cheering. Then she went back to her chair and sat for some time without picking up the knitting. The parcel had been sent by Eliza's child. She had half supposed this since Chapter 9 in her own private arrangement of events. But it had remained supposition. Now it had the firm outline of likelihood, and the man in the lane, the man who had come to St. Mary Mead, who had found the letters, who had spoken to Clara Winfield by the cricket field, was not an anonymous corrector of old records, but a person with a direct and living connection to everything that had happened 40 years before. He had come in person. He had spoken to Clara, and then, instead of proceeding further, he had apparently withdrawn, sent the parcel, made his presence felt, but left the resolution to whatever it might become. That, thought Miss Marple, was either very patient or very deliberate, and in her experience, the two were more often the same thing than people generally supposed. Chapter 8. The Night the Steamer Departed. Miss Marple had always found that the most useful quality a person could bring to the examination of the past was not cleverness, precisely, but a willingness to take it seriously. The past has a way of being treated as settled, finished, catalogued, beyond the reach of present consequence, and people are frequently surprised when it declines to remain so. She had never shared this surprise, in her experience, as nothing that involved human feeling was ever entirely finished. It merely waited, with the particular patience of things that have nowhere else to go. On Sunday morning she attended service at St. Mary Mead's parish church, as was her invariable habit, and sat in her usual pew with the attentiveness she brought equally to devotion and observation. The church was pleasantly full for September. The summer visitors had departed, which reduced the numbers, but the autumn regulars had returned to their accustomed places with the fidelity of migratory birds who have found, after considerable travel, that their original destination was preferable after all. Clara Winfield sat 3 pews forward, in the position she had occupied for as long as Miss Marple could remember, upright and composed, and entirely unrevealing of whatever interior weather was currently prevailing. She didn't look back. She sang the hymns with her usual measured accuracy. She was, to all visible purposes, exactly herself. Mr. Thornton was not in church. He had mentioned on Thursday that he intended to complete his work at the cottage and return to Shropshire by Saturday at the latest, and she assumed he had done so. But before his departure he had been kind enough to leave word at the 3 Crowns, as he had promised, that she was welcome to the devotional book if she felt it might be of use in her inquiries. Miss Marple had collected it on Friday afternoon, and it now sat on her sitting-room table, patient and dark-covered, alongside the unsigned card and the carefully preserved black cord. After the service she walked home by the longer route, past the old post road that ran along the western edge of the village before curving back toward the church and the newer lanes. It was a walk she had always found clarifying. Something in the slight elevation of the ground along that stretch, and the unobstructed view of the fields, gave the mind a sense of proportion that more enclosed walks did not quite provide. She was considering the man by the cricket field. She had thought about him with increasing attention throughout Saturday evening and into Sunday. He had come to St. Mary Mead. He had found letters among Henry Ashcombe's papers. This established that he had been in contact with Mr. Thornton, or had otherwise obtained access to Ashcombe's effects. He had confronted Clara Winfield directly, not at her door but in a lane, which suggested either that he had sought the encounter deliberately, or that he had encountered her by chance and recognized his opportunity. He had identified himself, by implication, as Eliza's son, and then apparently he had withdrawn. The withdrawal was what interested her most. A man who had come so far, yet who had taken the trouble to trace his mother's history and make himself known to the person most directly responsible for its unhappy shape, and who had then stepped back and sent a parcel rather than pressing his case. That was not a man driven by anger. Or if he had been driven by anger, he had governed it. He had chosen a particular kind of pressure, not confrontation, not exposure, but the quiet return of an object that made its own argument without requiring him to make it. That required a considerable degree of self-command. It also suggested, she thought, that his object was not punishment but acknowledgement. There is a distinction between those two desires, and it is not always recognized, because they can produce superficially similar behavior. But the brooch sent in a parcel, with 7 words and no signature, was the act of someone seeking the restoration of a record rather than the infliction of a consequence. And she was still thinking about this when she reached her front door. On Monday she wrote a letter to Mr. Thornton in Shropshire. She thanked him for the devotional book and for his general kindness in the matter, and she inquired, as gently as she could make it sound, whether in the course of sorting Mr. Ashcombe's correspondence he had encountered any letters from or relating to a Miss Eliza Morton, and whether he had by any chance been approached by any person claiming connection to that name. His reply arrived by Wednesday's post, which was prompt by any standard, and suggested either that he had expected the inquiry, or that he was the kind of man who cleared his correspondence the same afternoon it arrived, which in Miss Marple's experience was a rarer virtue than it ought to be. He had indeed found letters. There were 11 in total, written over a period of several decades, all in the same hand, all addressed simply to dear H, and signed with an initial, the letter E, without further identification. They were not love letters, precisely or not exclusively. They were the letters of a person maintaining, at great distance and over great time, a thread of communication with someone from whom they had been separated under difficult circumstances. They spoke of a new country, and its strangeness and gradual familiarity. They spoke of employment, of small domestic satisfactions and occasional hardships, and eventually of a daughter, not a son. Miss Marple paused over this detail and read it again. A daughter. Mr. Thornton wrote that the later letters made reference to the writer's daughter with evident warmth and pride, and that one letter in particular, written when the daughter was perhaps in her teens, described her as possessing a very precise and determined mind, and a strong sense of what was owed to people who had been treated unfairly. A daughter with a strong sense of what was owed. Miss Marple set the letter down on the table beside the devotional book, and allowed herself a moment of quiet recalibration. Young Tom Alsop had said a man had spoken to Clara Winfield in the lane. He had said the man had said it concerned his mother. She had assumed, with perhaps insufficient examination, that this meant a son. But Tom was 19, and the voices had come to him through a hedge, and the word he'd used, him, was the word one defaults to in uncertainty, particularly for a voice that might have been lower than expected, or partially obscured by distance and leaf, a daughter with a determined mind. It was Eliza's daughter who had sent the parcel. It was Eliza's daughter who had come to St. Mary Mead and spoken to Clara Winfield in the lane by the cricket field. And it was Eliza's daughter who had then withdrawn, not from weakness or defeat, but with the deliberateness of someone who has done what she came to do and has left the remaining portion to those whose responsibility it properly is. Mr. Thornton's letter contained one further detail. He had found, among the last of the letters, the most recent dated some 18 months before Ashcombe's death, a passage which he quoted because he felt, he wrote, that Miss Marple would find it pertinent. He had copied it out in his careful schoolmaster's hand, and she wrote, "I have never asked for anything to be undone. What was done cannot be, but I have hoped, in the way that one continues to hope when hope has long ceased to be reasonable, that somewhere in that village there is someone who knows the truth of it. Not for my sake, for hers. She deserved to leave differently. Miss Marple read this twice, as she had read the card that had arrived with the brooch. Then she folded the letter and sat for a long time with her hands in her lap and the September light lying quietly across the floor, doing nothing in particular except be what it was. She deserved to leave differently. That was the whole of it, really. Not justice in any formal or punitive sense. Not the exposure of Clara Winfield's comfortable reputation, or the public rehearsal of old wrongs. Simply the correction of a record, the restoration to Eliza Morton, at whatever distance, of the truth that had been taken from her on the night she had walked away from a boathouse alone, toward an uncertain future she had not chosen. Miss Marple thought of the steamer sailing from an English port 40 years ago, with a young woman aboard who had said she would not defend herself where trust was absent. She thought of Henry Ashcombe standing by the water long after Eliza had walked away, holding whatever it was he had not yet understood. She thought of an unused railway ticket pressed between the pages of a book of evening prayers, the destination worn away by time. The truth had been preserved, as the brooch had been preserved. It had waited in the dark of various drawers and boxes with the quiet persistence of things that know themselves to be owed something. And now it had arrived, by black cord and careful handwriting, into the mild September morning of a small English village that had spent 40 years believing a version of events that had never quite been true. It was, Miss Marple thought, remarkably patient of it. Chapter 9. A Visit to Rosebank Cottage. There is a kind of conversation that cannot be arrived at directly. It must be approached in the way one approaches a deer in a field, not with any particular stealth, precisely, but with a quality of movement that does not announce itself as purposeful, that arrives by its own natural-seeming route and pauses without apparent design at the place it intended to reach all along. Miss Marple had conducted a great many such conversations over the course of her life, and she had learned that the preparation for them was at least as important as the conversations themselves. One must be clear, beforehand, about what one wants to accomplish, not what one wants to say, which is a different and considerably less reliable guide. What she wanted to accomplish, in visiting Clara Winfield on Thursday morning, was not a confession. Confessions, in the formal sense, were for the authorities, for clergymen, for the particular intimacy of close relationships. They were not generally the appropriate instrument for a conversation between two village acquaintances of long standing. What she wanted was something more modest and, she thought, more genuinely useful, an acknowledgement. The quiet, private admission that a wrong had been done, that it had had consequences, and that those consequences extended further than Clara Winfield had perhaps allowed herself to recognise. Whether this was achievable depended, as so much depended, upon the particular quality of the person involved. And Miss Marple, who had observed Clara Winfield for a good many years, believed it was. Rosebank Cottage sat at the far end of the Willow Lane house garden, separated from the larger property by a low hedge and a stretch of lawn that Clara maintained with the same careful attention she brought to her personal presentation. It was a pleasant building of the late Victorian period, smaller than its neighbour, and rather more comfortable for being so, with a south-facing aspect and clematis on the front wall that had this year performed particularly well. Miss Marple had always thought that one could tell a great deal about a person's interior life from the state of their clematis. Not the grand showpiece varieties, but the ordinary climbing kind, which requires consistent attention over several years before it rewards the gardener with anything worth admiring. Clara's was very fine. She answered the door herself, which suggested she had seen the approach from a window and had chosen to receive the visit personally rather than delegate it to Mrs. Oakes, her daily woman. This, too, was informative. "Miss Marple," she said. Her tone was measured, as always, but there was in it a quality that had not been present in previous encounters, a certain subdued readiness, as though she had been expecting this visit or something very like it, and had decided in the interval on a course of conduct. She led the way into the sitting-room, which was well furnished in the manner of someone who has inherited good things, and knows how to live among them without being overwhelmed by their history. A small fire burned in the grate, though the morning was not cold enough to strictly require it, the fire of someone who has wanted the comfort of light and warmth rather than their functional necessity. Tea was produced with quiet efficiency. They spoke for several minutes about the clematis, Uri, the Church Restoration Fund, and the coming autumn fair, with the mutual courtesy of two people who understand that certain courtesies are not mere delay, but are themselves a form of respect for what is to follow. It was Clara who stepped through the door first. "You have continued your inquiries," she said. It was not quite a question, and not quite an accusation, but occupied the ground between them in the manner of a statement that invites a response without demanding one. "I have," said Miss Marple. "I hope you will understand that it was never my intention to cause distress, only to understand as fully as I could what had happened." "And do you understand it now?" Clara set down her cup with careful precision. Her hands were steady. Her eyes, meeting Miss Marple's, held a weariness that was distinct from the social composure she usually wore. Not the weariness of age or illness, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been maintaining a position of great difficulty for a very long time, and has lately begun to feel the weight of it in a new way. "I believe so," said Miss Marple. "I know about the letters. Mr. Thornton was good enough to write to me." She paused. "I know that Eliza corresponded with Mr. Ashcombe for many years. I know that he kept her letters, and I know that her daughter came to St. Mary Mead." Clara was still for a moment. Outside the window a robin had taken up a position on the garden wall, and was attending to something invisible in the grass below, with the focused intensity of small birds going about their business. "She came 3 weeks before Henry died," Clara said at last. "I did not know who she was at first. She introduced herself simply. Margaret Morton, she said, though she used her mother's name rather than her married one, if she has a married one. She was perhaps 40, very composed. The kind of person who has decided what they intend to do and has long since stopped being uncertain about it." A slight, involuntary expression crossed her face, not quite respect and not quite discomfort, but something that acknowledged both. "She had found the letters among Henry's papers. She told me he had given her access to them some months before his death. He had written to her, apparently. He had found her through Eliza's last letters, which contained an address." Clara paused. He knew he was unwell. I think he wanted to set things in order, in the only way that was available to him. He could not undo what had happened," said Miss Marple, "but he could ensure that the truth was not buried with him." "Yes." Clara looked at the fire for a moment. "She showed me one of the letters, Henry's letter to her. He told her what he knew, or what he had come to know, which he admitted was late in arriving. He had not understood, at the time, how the brooch came to be missing. He had believed—" She stopped. "He had believed what he was given to believe. By the time he understood differently, Eliza had been gone for many years, and he had not managed to find her, or not found her in time for the knowledge to change anything practical." "But it changed something in him," said Miss Marple. "It did. His letter to the daughter made that plain." Clara's voice had reduced to the level of someone speaking primarily for their own benefit, finding in the speaking a form of discipline. "He wrote that he had kept the brooch because Eliza had left it with him the night by the lake. Gave it to him, he said, as a kind of proof. She had told him she had not taken it, and she had given him the brooch itself as evidence. He had kept it all those years, not knowing what to do with it, and I think keeping it was his way of keeping faith with her, even after everything else had failed." Miss Marple received this quietly, and it altered the shape of several things. The brooch had been given, not recovered, not found among Eliza's effects, but entrusted to Henry on the very night of the argument, before she left. She had known what was being said about her, and she had placed the evidence in the only hands she trusted, and then she'd gone. The courage of that, thought Miss Marple, was very considerable. "Margaret," she said, "Eliza's daughter. When she came to see you, what did she ask for?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "She did not ask for anything," she said. "That was in many ways the most difficult part of it. She sat in this room, in that chair, as it happens, and she told me what she knew and what Henry had written to her and what had happened to her mother in the years after she left England. A brief pause. Eliza had a reasonable life, she said. She worked. She married eventually. She had Margaret. She was not unhappy precisely, but she carried the weight of what had been said about her. She had left without being able to clear her name, and that, Margaret said, had been a wound that never entirely healed. "And then?" said Miss Marple. "And then she left the parcel," said Clara. "She said she thought I ought to have it returned to me, or rather, that I ought to see it returned. She did not post it herself, as it turned out. She arranged for it to be posted from abroad, some weeks later, so that it would arrive after the funeral was complete and after she herself had come and gone." Clara met Miss Marple's eyes with an expression that had moved a considerable distance from its starting point in the conversation. She was very precise about what she wanted, not a prosecution, not a public account, only that I should know that the record, as she put it, required correction, and that I should be the one to correct it. "A considerable responsibility to leave with someone," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Clara. She looked at her hands, though perhaps not an unreasonable one. The robin outside had concluded its business with the invisible thing in the grass and had departed for some other portion of the garden. The fire shifted quietly in the grate. In the particular stillness that followed, two women of considerable age and experience sat together in a well-kept cottage room and allowed the truth, which had been a long time arriving, to occupy the space it was owed. "I should like to do what is right," said Clara Winfield at last. "I am not entirely certain what that looks like, but I should like very much to do it." Miss Marple set down her cup, folded her hands in her lap, and allowed herself the smallest, most private, most entirely genuine expression of relief. "I think," she said, "that we might consider that together." Chapter 10. Sunlight on the Churchyard Stone. October arrived in St. Mary Mead with its customary lack of announcement. The elms along the lane completed their surrender to gold. The mornings acquired a crispness that required an extra layer, and the village settled into the particular rhythm of the later year, slower, more interior, inclined toward fires in the evening and the drawing of curtains while the light still held, as though the season itself preferred the comfortable over the spectacular. 3 weeks had passed since Miss Marple's visit to Rosebank Cottage. In that time, certain things had happened quietly and without public commentary. Clara Winfield had consulted Mr. Fellows of Fellows and Briggs on a matter she described to him as a personal obligation concerning the Morton family grave in St. Mary Mead churchyard. Mr. Fellows, who was a discreet man by profession and inclination, had facilitated the necessary arrangements with the stonemason at Barton Lacey without finding it necessary to discuss the details with anyone. The stonemason had come and gone on a Tuesday, which was a quieter day in the churchyard than most. A letter had been written by Clara and sent to an address in Canada that Miss Marple had obtained from Mr. Thornton on Clara's behalf. Whether it had been received, and what it had contained beyond its essential acknowledgment, was a private matter between the two women and not Miss Marple's to know. She had not asked. There are forms of resolution that belong entirely to the people involved, and the appropriate role for an observer, once the observation has served its purpose, is to withdraw. Miss Marple herself had withdrawn, in the usual sense, to the ordinary occupations of her days. The Dutch narcissi were in the ground. The cardigan for her great niece in Torquay was complete, and had been dispatched with a note. She had begun a second reading of the Lake District novel from the reading circle, finding on the second pass, as she generally did, that the ostensible subject of a book yielded to a more interesting one upon reflection. It was on a mild Thursday afternoon that she found herself in the churchyard. She had come in the first instance to leave chrysanthemums on the grave of an old friend, Mrs. Cartwright, who had died the previous spring and whose plot was in the newer section of the churchyard beyond the yew. Having done so, she made her way back along the stone path through the older graves, where the Morton family plot occupied a modest corner between the east wall and a copper beech of considerable antiquity. The inscription was simple, The stone, a flat ledger set into the ground before the upright marker bearing the names of Eliza's parents, read, in the neat, our unpretentious lettering of the Barton Lacey stonemason, in memory also of Eliza Morton, 1903 to 1971. She left in sorrow. She's not forgotten. Miss Marple stood before it for a moment in the October sunlight, which lay across the stone at that particular afternoon angle that makes old surfaces luminous. The moss and the lichen caught in low gold, the carved letters briefly sharpened. She's not forgotten. It was not, she reflected, a grand statement. It did not exonerate, explain, or accuse. It simply affirmed, quietly and in public in the permanent medium of stone, that a name had been recalled and a person restored to the record of the village that had once let her leave without the defence she deserved. In the grammar of such things it was sufficient. It was perhaps exactly sufficient. She had brought the brooch with her. She had not, upon reflection, been certain what to do with it. It had arrived anonymously, and its original owner was 40 years dead, and its subsequent keeper was 3 weeks in the ground himself. It was not, strictly speaking, hers, but Margaret Morton had sent it into her hands, by implication, if not by direct address, and it had rested on Miss Marple's sitting-room table long enough to acquire something of the quality of a responsibility. She had written, in the end, to Margaret, through Mr. Thornton's forwarding address, asking simply what she wished done with it. Margaret's reply had been brief, composed in the same upright hand as the original card, and said only, "Keep it if you will." My mother would not have wanted it returned to that house. She left it with Henry because she trusted him. I believe she would find it acceptable where it is. Miss Marple had read this with a sense of something carefully completed, and had placed the brooch in the small dish on her mantelpiece where she kept objects she valued. A sea-glass pebble from a Cornish holiday, a button from a coat belonging to her mother, a coin of uncertain origin and certain affection. Now she stood in the October churchyard and looked at the stone, and thought about Eliza Morton, who had been 26 or 27 when she'd handed a pearl brooch to a young man she trusted, and walked away from a village that had not trusted her. She had built a life at a considerable distance from this stone, from this light, from the copper beech with its late leaves coming down in the mild afternoon air. She had had a daughter who possessed, it seemed, a very precise and determined mind, and a strong sense of what was owed to people who'd been treated unfairly. That was, considered from a certain angle, a considerable legacy. It was Mrs. Bantry who found her there, arriving through the lich gate with her own flowers and her own destination, and pausing with the instinctive courtesy of a woman who recognises contemplation and does not immediately disturb it. She waited until Miss Marple turned, and then came to stand beside her with the comfortable ease of long friendship. "The new inscription," said Mrs. Bantry, reading it with the direct attention she brought to everything. "I had heard there was one. Do you know the family?" "A little," said Miss Marple, "at a distance." Mrs. Bantry looked at the stone for a moment with her head slightly tilted. "She is not forgotten," she read again. That is a very particular thing to put. Not the usual form at all. She glanced at Miss Marple with the cheerful shrewdness of someone who does not miss a great deal. "I suppose there is a